In November 1532, 168 men walked into the most powerful empire in the Western Hemisphere. By the end of the afternoon, it was over. Not through superior numbers, not through military genius, not through any strategy that military historians would later recognize as particularly sophisticated, through a book nobody in the room could read, and a disease that had arrived a decade earlier and done most of the work already. The Inca Empire controlled more than 2.5 million square kilometers. Its population approached 10 million people. Its road network stretched further than the Roman roads at their peak. Its administrative system had solved problems that European political theorists would not formally describe for another 2 centuries. Francisco Pizarro had 168 men. The arithmetic should not work, and yet it did. The question every historian asks is, how did 168 men defeat an empire of 10 million? That is the wrong question. The right question is, what had already gone catastrophically wrong inside the Inca Empire before Pizarro arrived? Because by the time those 168 men walked into Cajamarca, the empire was not waiting to be conquered. It was already dying, and it didn't know it yet. Francisco Pizarro was not a military genius. He was not a strategist, not an aristocrat, not a man of learning. He was an illiterate pig farmer from Extremadura, a region of Spain so remote and so poor that its primary export was desperate men willing to die on foreign continents for a share of whatever could be stolen there. He had one observable quality in abundance. He did not stop. His first attempt to find the rumored empire to the south in 1524 ended in swamp, starvation, and retreat. His second attempt, in 1526, nearly killed his partner Diego de Almagro, who took an indigenous arrow to the face and lost an eye before they turned back. When the governor of Panama declared the expeditions a failure and ordered the men home, Pizarro walked to the beach. He drew a line in the sand. He told his men that on one side of that line was everything they already had: poverty, obscurity, the long voyage home to nothing. On the other side was the possibility of gold beyond anything they could imagine. He waited. 13 men crossed to his side. They called themselves the famous 13. They survived the next 7 months on Gorgona Island, a place whose primary offerings were venomous snakes, constant rain, and the growing certainty that they had made a catastrophic decision. They were waiting for a resupply ship that took 7 months to arrive. When it arrived, Pizarro did not sail home. He sailed further south. What they found changed everything. An enormous trading vessel built from balsa wood, carrying textiles, ceramics, and objects of gold and silver. The crew spoke a language none of Pizarro's men recognized. The merchandise pointed to a civilization of a scale they had only heard in rumors. Pizarro took enough gold to fill a display case, released the vessel, and sailed to Spain. He walked into the court of King Charles V and placed the objects on a table. The king gave him a title and authorization to conquer whatever he found. He returned in 1531 with 168 men. He landed at Tumbes, the coastal city they had briefly visited on the second expedition, expecting to find the thriving port that had confirmed all their rumors. The city was empty. The buildings had collapsed inward. The streets were silent. Dogs moved through the rubble before the soldiers did, and the soldiers understood from the dogs' behavior what they were finding in the ruins. Pizarro stood in the wreckage of a city he had never conquered and understood that something had happened here that he did not yet comprehend. He didn't know he was standing at the edge of a catastrophe that had started 7 years earlier. He didn't know the catastrophe had done most of his work for him. The thing that destroyed the Inca Empire before Pizarro arrived had no general, no strategy, no formation, no orders of battle. It moved through the continental trade networks of South America the way fire moves through dry grass, along every available path simultaneously, faster than any human response could contain it. Smallpox, It had entered South America from Spanish settlements in the Caribbean and Central America sometime around 1524. The same year, Pizarro's first expedition left Panama, failing in the swamp. It moved south through indigenous trading networks, carried by people who did not know they were carrying it, into populations that had never encountered it and had built no immunity across generations of exposure. Picture a relay station in the Andes. High up, 4,000 meters, a runner arrives from the north. He's one of the Chasquis, the professional relay runners who maintained the empire's communication network, capable of covering 400 kilometers in a day. He is supposed to hand off his message to the next runner and rest. He sits down against the stone wall of the station. He does not get up. The message in his hand is never delivered. That station, which had functioned for generations, goes quiet. And then the station south of it, and the one south of that, the roads the Inca had built, 40,000 kilometers of engineered highway across mountains, deserts, and jungle, were still standing. They still ran from one end of the empire to the other. They were just becoming empty. In Europe, centuries of exposure to smallpox had produced partial resistance, not immunity, survivability. A European epidemic was catastrophic. In the Andes, the disease moved through communities at a mortality rate that contemporary Spanish observers, accustomed to European epidemic disease, described with visible shock in their accounts. Entire villages emptied, agricultural terraces that had been tended for generations fell untended. The Quipu Camayocs, the specialists who maintained the empire's administrative records in their system of knotted cords, died before they could transmit their knowledge. The institutional memory of the civilization began dissolving at exactly the moment it was most needed. By 1527, the disease had reached the emperor. Huayna Capac, the 11th Sapa Inca, the son of the sun, died of smallpox. His designated heir died within days, possibly of the same disease. What happened next was not a smooth succession. What happened next was a power vacuum in a civilization that had never developed a formal mechanism for managing disputed succession. Because the Sapa Inca was supposed to be divine, and divine rulers were not supposed to die suddenly in the middle of a pandemic without having resolved the question of who came next. The empire was already dying when the Civil War started. The Civil War was simply the empire dying faster. Two sons claimed the throne. Huasca, backed by the hereditary nobility in Cusco, represented the traditional power structure, the old legitimacy. Atahualpa, backed by the battle-hardened northern armies that his father had spent decades building, represented military force without traditional legitimacy. They fought for 3 years. By the time Atahualpa's armies finished, entire provinces had been depopulated. Villages that had backed Huasca were burned. Atahualpa's generals, who had spent years in brutal campaign, executed Huasca's family, his wives, his children, the nobility who had served him, anyone who might form the basis of a future challenge. Bodies were left visible along roads as messages. The runners who carried news of these events moved along roads past those messages. The empire was still intact on paper. The roads were still there. The Quipu records still existed, wherever Quipu Camayoc still lived to read them. But the civilization those roads had connected was not the same civilization it had been 6 years earlier. Pizarro did not conquer a strong empire. He walked into the wreckage of one, at the exact moment its wounds were freshest. Atahualpa received the first reports of the strangers weeks before the meeting at Cajamarca. He was at the thermal springs outside the city, resting with his court after 3 years of civil war. Around him, the generals who had won the war, the women of his household, servants, administrators, the surviving apparatus of imperial life, reassembling itself after the violence. The reports were puzzling. Pale men, strange clothing, enormous animals no one had a name for, weapons that produced fire and thunder. He listened. He fought. He asked questions. He was not frightened. This is important to understand. His absence of fear was not arrogance without basis. He had 80,000 soldiers. He had just finished winning a 3-year civil war against an opponent with the full institutional support of the Inca nobility. He had marched his armies from one end of the empire to the other and prevailed. 168 strangers walking through his territory without permission were not, by any rational measure, a threat. They were a curiosity. He sent them a gift. Some ceramics, some food, a gesture of imperial magnanimity toward people he had not yet decided how to categorize. Then he agreed to meet them in Cajamarca. He did not know that a man who draws lines in the sand and asks people to cross them does not arrange meetings for diplomatic purposes. He was still thinking in the logic of his world. Pizarro was already operating in a different one. The night before Cajamarca, Pizarro's men could not sleep. This is documented. Multiple accounts describe the Spanish camp that night, and they agree on the atmosphere. Men talking too loudly or not talking at all. Priests moving through the camp. Soldiers doing things with their hands, checking equipment that didn't need checking. They had agreed to spring an ambush on an emperor surrounded by thousands of attendants in the middle of a city deep inside an empire of 10 million people. They were 168 men. Some of them had not fully processed what they had agreed to do until that night. One account records soldiers urinating on themselves from fear. Pizarro spoke to them. The accounts of what he said vary, but the accounts agree that afterward, the talking stopped and the men slept. Pizarro did not sleep. He was arranging the positions of his cavalry. November 1809, 1900 and 2022. Atahualpa entered Cajamarca in the late afternoon. He was carried on a golden litter by 80 nobles, each one dressed in matching livery, moving in perfect synchronized rhythm. Ahead of them, servants swept the ground, removing pebbles, clearing the path. The procession stretched back through the city gates. It took 2 hours for the full column to enter the plaza. 6,000 people, almost none of them armed. This was a diplomatic meeting, and showing up armed to a diplomatic meeting was a gesture of distrust. It communicated weakness. Atahualpa was not weak. He had 80,000 soldiers camped in the hills outside the city. He did not need to bring weapons into a plaza to speak with 168 foreigners. The plaza at Cajamarca was large, enclosed on 3 sides by long stone buildings, open on the 4th. It could hold a small army. It was empty. Not a single Spaniard was visible. Atahualpa looked around the plaza. He asked where the strangers were. A priest emerged from one of the buildings. His name was Vicente de Valverde. He was carrying a Bible in one hand and a crucifix in the other, and he walked toward the golden litter with the particular confidence of a man who had been rehearsing this moment and believed it had cosmic significance. He began speaking. Through a translator of limited ability, he explains the theological and legal position of the Spanish crown, that God had given dominion over all lands to the Pope, who had given it to the King of Spain, who had given Valverde the authority to inform the Emperor of his obligation to submit. Atahualpa listened to the translation. He asked, "Where does it say this?" Valverde held out the Bible. Atahualpa took it. He had never seen a book before. The Inca had no written language in the alphabetic sense. Information was stored in the quipu, the knotted cord system, and in memory, and in the spoken authority of living administrators. A flat object covered with repeated marks was not a technology his civilization had developed. He turned it over, he opened it, he brought it to his ear, as some accounts say, as if it might speak. It didn't. He dropped it. Valverde turned toward the buildings and began shouting. What happened in the next 30 seconds would be debated, reinterpreted, and moralized about for 500 years. But first, one of the horses screamed. It had been penned in the dark behind a stone wall for hours, smelling thousands of people on the other side. and when the doors opened, it came out wrong, sideways, crashing into the wall, nearly throwing its rider. The rider cursed at it in a way that appeared in no account of the battle, because accounts of battles do not include that kind of detail. A soldier near the first gun vomited from fear before the signal was given, quietly against a wall, and then stood up and waited. These things happened. Then the signal came. The guns fired. If you have never heard a 16th century arquebus discharge in an enclosed stone plaza, you cannot fully imagine what the sound meant to the people in that square. It was not the sound of a weapon. It was a sound that had no category in Inca experience, louder than thunder, produced by something man-sized, accompanied by smoke so thick that the Spanish soldiers immediately lost sight of each other and had to find their way through the chaos by sound. Then the horses came out of the buildings. The Inca soldiers in the plaza had trained their entire lives for warfare. They were experienced. They were brave. They understood formation, tactics, the management of fear in combat. None of their training had included animals the size of horses. The horses wore armor. They moved at speeds that a human in tight formation cannot effectively respond to. They were ridden by men with steel swords, and the noise they made added to the guns and the smoke and the chaos of 6,000 people suddenly trying to move in the same direction in an enclosed space produced something that combat veterans later described in their accounts as unlike any battle they had ever participated in. Not a battle, a rupture in how the world was supposed to work. The litters collapsed. The nobles carrying Atahualpa fell as horses moved through them. The attendants who had spent their careers in ceremonial proximity to the Son of the Sun had no protocol for what was happening. Some tried to hold the litter upright with their bare hands as the horses came through. Some succeeded for a moment. Then they didn't. Men were crushed against the walls by the weight of bodies pressing toward exits that weren't there. Some sections of the enclosure wall collapsed outward. People fell through the gaps and kept running. The Spanish infantry moved through the confusion with steel swords. The Inca had weapons, clubs, slings, axes. Stone and bronze against steel armor is a different proposition than stone and bronze against unprotected bodies. The Spanish soldiers were struck. They were hit. They were not stopped. Approximately 3,000 people died in that plaza. The engagement lasted less than 30 minutes. Pizarro's soldiers reached the golden litter. They raised their weapons toward Atahualpa. Pizarro ran between them. He physically threw himself into the blades. He took a cut across his hand, which is recorded as the only Spanish wound of the entire encounter. He had not protected Atahualpa out of compassion. He needed him breathing. Outside the walls, 70,000 soldiers stood in formation. They had heard the guns. They could see the smoke rising from the plaza. Some of them had been soldiers for a decade, men who had survived the Civil War, men who had seen things on campaign that most people in the Empire had not. They stood. They did not advance. Not because they were cowards, because the Sapper Inca, the Son of the Sun, the axis around which the entire command structure of the Inca military was organized, was inside that plaza. And without a command from the Sapper Inca, the system that governed their actions had no protocol for what to do. The empire had been designed so that all authority flowed from one source. That source was sitting in a Spanish tent, bleeding from a wound on his wrist, watching Pizarro calculate what happened next. 70,000 men, 400 to 1. Standing still, Atahualpa was not without options. He was a prisoner, but he was also the only person in the Inca world whose authority could move armies, transfer resources, and direct the administrative machinery of a continental empire. He looked at the room where he was being held. He stood up. He walked to the wall. He raised his arm and drew a line at the height of his outstretched hand. He would fill this room with gold to that line. He would fill 2 additional rooms with silver, all of it delivered within 2 months. In exchange, freedom. Pizarro agreed. What followed was the largest ransom transaction in recorded human history. For 2 months, runners carried Atahualpa's orders through the empire, to temples, to palaces, to sacred sites that had accumulated centuries of offering. The objects began arriving: golden cups, silver ceremonial vessels, ornamental pieces from sites so old that no living person knew exactly when they had been placed there. The Spanish soldiers took each object and assessed it. Then they put it in the fire. The great golden sun disk from the Coricancha, the Temple of the Sun in Cusco, one of the most sacred objects in the Inca world, a disc measuring 2 meters across, representing the divine source from which the Inca emperor derived his authority, was placed into a melting furnace, along with everything else. Nobody looked at it closely before it went in. The workers operating the furnaces were not instructed to pause. The accounting that mattered was the weight of the resulting bar, not the nature of the object that had produced it. Objects that had taken craftsmen years to produce were in the furnace for a few hours and came out as standardized ingots. The smell of melted gold is, according to accounts, a specific and persistent smell. Metallic, sweet, and wrong, in a way that is difficult to describe to someone who has not encountered it. The total value, in modern terms, exceeded $500 million. Pizarro distributed it according to military rank. Then he convened a trial. The charges: idol worship, polygamy, treason against a king Atahualpa had never heard of before a Spanish priest mentioned him 8 months earlier. The court consisted of Pizarro's officers. The verdict was announced after deliberation. Atahualpa asked what he had failed to deliver. The rooms were full. The agreement had been kept. He had ordered his generals to stand down, his administrators to cooperate, his people to bring their sacred objects to be weighed. There was no satisfactory answer to this question. The sentence was death by burning. A gesture of theological mercy was extended. If Atahualpa accepted baptism, he would be strangled instead. Burning was the punishment for heretics. Strangulation was, in the carefully maintained moral arithmetic of 16th century Spanish Catholicism, the more compassionate option. He was given the Christian name Juan de Atahualpa. He was strangled in the public square of Cajamarca in 1533. Some accounts record that he asked, before his death, what would happen to his body. He was told it would be given a Christian burial. For the Inca, the preservation of the royal mummy was a religious obligation. The body of a dead emperor continued to participate in imperial ceremony, consulted by priests, carried in processions. A Christian burial meant none of this would be possible. He was strangled anyway. The gold was already in bars. Pizarro installed a 17-year-old named Manco Inca on the throne. Manco had hated Atahualpa's faction. He was young enough to be managed, legitimate enough to provide institutional cover for Spanish control, and grateful enough, initially, for his elevation to cooperate. For a few years, the arrangement held. Then Pizarro's brothers, who had absorbed the lesson that conquest means permanent dominance, made the kinds of decisions that men make when they believe consequences have been suspended. They humiliated Manco publicly, took his wife, treated him as a decoration rather than an administrator, and generally behaved as though the puppet emperor was a fixed condition rather than a temporary political agreement. Manco escaped. He sent runners through the empire, not with administrative directives, with a different kind of message. He raised an army, 100,000 soldiers. He besieged Cusco for nearly a year. He came closer to reversing the conquest than anything that had occurred since Cajamarca. He failed, partly because Pizarro's indigenous allies, the peoples who had spent a century under Inca subjugation and had chosen Spanish alliance over continued Inca domination, outnumbered even his force. The conquest of the Inca was, in significant measure, an indigenous civil war with Spanish participation. The conventional telling almost always leaves this out, and then the conquistadors began killing each other. Diego de Almagro, the man who had lost his eye on the second expedition, who had shared every risk and every horror of the enterprise from the beginning, felt he had received an inadequate share of the proceeds. He was correct. He seized Cusco. He imprisoned Pizarro's brothers. War between the factions followed. Almagro was captured in 1538. He was strangled, the same method used for Atahualpa. Francisco Pizarro was assassinated in his palace in Lima in 1541, stabbed to death over Sunday lunch by the son of the man he had just killed, who arrived with 20 men and walked through the governor's residence until they found him. The man who had once drawn a line in the sand on a beach in Panama and asked people to choose between poverty and gold, died on the floor of his dining room with his throat cut, drawing a cross in his own blood with one finger, asking for a priest who did not arrive in time. Gonzalo Pizarro, the last surviving brother, led a revolt against the Spanish crown when it attempted to curtail the Conquistadors' accumulated privileges. He executed the first viceroy of Peru. He controlled the territory for 3 years. He was defeated not by an army. He was defeated by a priest named Pedro de la Gasca, who arrived from Spain carrying no soldiers, only letters, and one simple offer: amnesty and property rights for anyone who switched sides. Gonzalo's army dissolved around him. He was beheaded in 1548. Manco Inca was stabbed to death by Spanish deserters he had trusted enough to give shelter. The last Inca emperor, Tupac Amaru, was beheaded in the central plaza of Cusco in 1572. A crowd of thousands watched it happen. Contemporary accounts describe the crowd going completely silent at the moment of the execution. And then, and this detail appears in multiple Spanish accounts, written by men who found it difficult to interpret, the crowd reached toward the blood on the ground, as if proximity to it preserved something that the execution was intended to end. The conventional version of this story is a story about European superiority. Steel over stone, gunpowder over clubs, the inevitable triumph of a more technically sophisticated civilization. This version is almost entirely wrong. 12 arquebuses do not defeat 80,000 soldiers in open terrain. The Inca military had spent a century defeating every challenger it encountered. If Atahualpa had arrived at Cajamarca with armed soldiers instead of ceremonial attendants, if the army outside the city had advanced when the guns fired, the outcome would have been different. The Inca Empire did not fall because Spaniards were stronger. It fell because it was already falling. Smallpox killed somewhere between a third and half the population in the 7 years before Pizarro arrived. The emperor died without a clear succession. The resulting civil war lasted 3 years and ended with the systematic execution of the losing bloodline. The winner took power over a depopulated, traumatized, politically fractured empire, and 6 months later walked into a meeting with 168 strangers without armed guards. Pizarro did not defeat a strong empire. He found a civilization at its moment of maximum internal damage and stood close enough to push. This is the pattern that history keeps producing. The Roman Empire did not fall to the barbarians because the barbarians were stronger. It fell because centuries of internal instability had hollowed out the institution before anyone reached the walls. The Ottoman Empire did not fall to European rivals because Europeans were stronger. It fell because decades of internal fragmentation, contested succession, and administrative overextension had made the institution brittle before the external pressure arrived. The Europeans simply walked into the space the Ottomans had already vacated. The match does not explain the fire. The match explains when the fire started. The fuel had been accumulating for years. What the Inca collapse specifically reveals is the danger of a particular kind of institutional design. The Inca system was extraordinarily efficient. The roads, the relay runners, the quipu record keeping, the centralized food distribution, all of it worked because all of it flowed from one source of authority. The moment that source was removed, the system had no protocol for continuing. 70,000 soldiers stood outside Cajamarca and did not advance because their command structure could not function without a command. The same design that had made the empire work made it catastrophically, precisely, structurally vulnerable to the thing Pizarro did. This is not a flaw unique to the Inca. It is the failure mode of any system that mistakes efficiency for resilience. That concentrates authority so completely that the institution cannot survive the removal of the authority it was built around. The empire fell in 30 minutes. What it had been built on top of did not. Somewhere in the Andes highlands today, an old woman is weaving on a loom that her grandmother taught her to use. The pattern she is weaving is a pattern her grandmother learned from her grandmother, going back generations that no written record has captured, because the people who kept those records kept them in knotted cords, and most of those cords were lost centuries ago. The Quechua language is spoken today by approximately 10 million people across Peru, Bolivia, Ecuador, and Colombia. The agricultural terraces that the Inca built into the Andean hillsides, precisely engineered for altitude, water management, and the specific growing conditions of high-altitude crops, are still in use. The roads, in places, are still walked. The bloodlines of the people who stood in that plaza in Cusco in 1572 and reached toward the blood on the ground continued. Their descendants are alive. They have always been alive. The empire that was stripped, melted, and reorganized into a Spanish colony could not be stripped of what had existed before it was an empire. Francisco Pizarro is dead. So are the Almagros, and Gonzalo Pizarro, and Atahualpa, and Huasca, and Huayna Capac, and Valverde, and Tupac Amaru, and every soldier who drew a line in the sand or crossed one. They were all consumed, with remarkable completeness, by the violence they set in motion. The Civil War consumed the Inca rulers. The Conquest consumed the Inca administrative class. The puppet arrangement consumed Manco Inca. The Conquistadors' Civil War consumed the Conquistadors. The Spanish crown consumed what remained. The architecture of the empire was gone within a generation. The civilization underneath it was not. The question this story keeps returning to is deceptively simple. How much of what we call a civilization is the institution? And how much is something older? The language, the way of organizing relationships, the pattern a grandmother teaches without a name for why it matters, that continues after the institution is gone. The people who reached toward the blood on the ground in Cusco in 1572 were not mourning an institution. They were keeping something alive that no conquest has ever successfully ended. The Inca Empire fell in an afternoon. What it was built on top of is still there.